A young woman falls to her death from a rugged California cliff. Months after she's buried, an investigator suspects she was pushed. Researchers try to determine a woman's cause of death 3,000 years after she died. How can they perform an autopsy without destroying her fragile, mummified shell? To catch a murderer, detectives must prove that a few splinters of bone are the remains of a woman who disappeared 2 years earlier. Time doesn't heal all wounds, a fact that keeps relentless detectives on the trail of cold or forgotten cases. With cutting-edge technology, forensic experts are able to travel back in time, months, years, or millennia, to coax mysteries out of the grave. From San Diego to San Francisco, California's coastal highways are some of the most magnificent drives in the world. Heading north, stretches of glittering sand and crowded freeways gradually give way to a vastly different landscape. As Highway 1 winds through the Monterey Peninsula, mountains collide with the sea in a majestic alliance of power and beauty. In Big Sur, California, the huge sky and boundless Pacific Ocean seduce visitors to the edge of the dizzying cliffs for a breathtaking view of the edge of the world and a snapshot by which to remember it. But sometimes the pull is too strong. On April 2nd, 1987, the Monterey County Sheriff's Department received a phone call that something horrible had happened at the Seal Beach Overlook. The body of a 20-year-old woman named Dina Hubbard Wild was lying near the base of a 600-foot precipice. It was not the first time the search and rescue squad had been dispatched to collect the remains of a victim lured too close to the edge. A deputy from the sheriff's office questioned the middle-aged couple waiting at the scene. They were Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, tourists from San Diego. They told the officer that their young companion had tumbled over silently when they weren't looking. The rescue squad retrieved the lifeless body from the bottom of the cliff. After a cursory examination by the coroner, Dina Wild was returned to her hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, and buried. At the Second Presbyterian Church in Louisville, Dina Wild's freak accident was still on people's minds months after she'd been buried. When services ended one Sunday, Dina's mother, Bobby Roberts, approached a lawyer named Steve Keeney. She needed help collecting insurance money after her daughter's death.
She wanted to collect burial insurance that she had as part of her benefits as a teacher, and the insurance company had told her no. We told her that sometimes a letter from a law firm cuts through the red tape, we'd give it a try.
Keeney knew that Bobby could really use the $3,500. He agreed to make a few phone calls for her on his own time. Keeney called Bobby's insurance company and uncovered the source of the holdup. They had never received Dina's death certificate. Keeney then called the Monterey coroner's office requesting a copy of the death certificate. But when the document arrived, it listed the cause of death as pending. Because Dina's death was presumed to be an accident, the rescue team had done little beyond retrieving the body. No evidence was collected, no photographs were taken. The body was sent to the Monterey coroner's office. Its analysis found no hint of foul play. Bobby Roberts' simple request was snowballing into a time-consuming tangle of bureaucracy. But Keeney pressed on. He contacted Monterey law enforcement only to discover that the case was in limbo. The certificate couldn't be issued until cause of death was determined, but the sheriff's department had, for all intents and purposes, dropped the case for lack of evidence. Dina had been dead for months. What could be holding things up? Keeney called Bobby's insurance company again to see if there was some way of expediting Bobby's payment.
When we called back, we stumbled into a fact that we never expected. That was that there was life insurance on Dina in someone else's name, and they had made a claim for that policy.
The amount that you're looking for is $35,000?
That claimant was none other than Virginia McGinnis, the woman with whom Dina had spent her final hours. Just a day before Dina's death, Virginia had taken a $35,000 policy out on the young woman. The day after Dina's death, she had tried to cash in. In Keeney's mind, Dina's accidental tumble was swiftly transforming into something more sinister. But without a witness or a body, how could he distinguish between a tragic fall and a push?
Ask yourself, how do you prove someone was pushed off a cliff? Imagine you're standing at the edge of the cliff and you fall. Think of the injuries. You'll be battered, there'll be broken bones, there'll be bruises on your body will end up at the foot of the cliff. And now put yourself back at the cliff and imagine you're pushed. Same thing, right? Same bruises, same broken bones. Well, not quite.
The suspicion that Dina may have been shoved over the edge was a chilling hypothesis, but it was still just speculation. To prove any wrongdoing, Keeney needed evidence. He went back to basics, trying to learn more about Dina's relationship with the older couple. Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, the parents of one of Dina's friends, had taken her into their San Diego home after she was separated from her husband. Dina's loneliness was relieved in the fun-filled months she'd spent with her surrogate parents. She was known for her blind devotion to new friends. Had she been duped by the McGinnis's kindness? To check his suspicions, Keeney secured a copy of the autopsy report from the Monterey coroner's office. In the report, he noticed something unusual. A blood test revealed the presence of a drug called amitriptyline, commonly known as Elavil. The antidepressant had never been prescribed to Dina. It had, however, been prescribed to Virginia's husband, B.J. Toxicologist Catherine Ham retested a vial of Dina's blood that had been frozen after her autopsy. Her job was to check for levels of the drug. Keeney hoped that if a crime was committed, it could be proven in the lab.
I think that a lot of people that commit crimes underestimate what we can do in the laboratory.
To test for the presence of chemicals in the blood, Ham adds a solvent into the sample. The tube is rocked for 20 minutes as the drugs move out of the blood and into the solvent. The solvent is then removed from the tube and evaporated. The reconstituted solvent is injected into a gas chromatograph, an instrument that separates compounds according to their chemical properties. Ham compared the standard for the drug and the products of its breakdown with the chromatograph of Dina's blood. They matched. Having been frozen for so long, Dina's blood was degraded. Ham was unable to determine exactly when Dina had taken the drug, or exactly how much she'd taken. What she did know was that Dina Wild had Elavil in her system when she died. With its disorienting and unpleasant side effects, it was hardly the kind of medication that Dina might have popped for a quick buzz. People taking the drug are usually stricken with weakness, nausea, and dizziness. These symptoms would be more pronounced in individuals who, like Dina, didn't take the medication on a regular basis. As he learned about Elavil's effects, Keeney realized that he needed to revise his image of Dina's last moments of life. If she'd been as queasy and unsteady as Ham suggested, she most likely would have slid down the mountain, not plunged. Though no crime scene photos had been taken, the period of time before the fall was well documented. Virginia had sent Dina's mother the roll of snapshots from the day of the accident as a gesture of condolence. Could these posed snapshots tell Keeney about the cause of Dina's death? At first glance, the 15 chronological pictures told the story of an average sightseeing junket. Dina seemed comfortable and happy as she posed for the camera. But as Keeney studied the pictures more carefully, he suspected that he was witnessing a murder plot.
The photograph of Virginia and B.J. McGinnis walking away from the car was taken by Dina Wild, and it is a signature photo. It's at the cliff where she would die a few minutes later. It's when the Elavil has kicked in and she knows something's wrong. She's leaving a note to the rest of us that will survive her. It's like an assault victim who takes their own blood and writes the name of their assailant. She's pointing the finger.
The Elavil had clearly taken effect in the subsequent picture. Dina's bright eyes had grown dull. Her features slackened. She seemed unable to stand on her own.
That's great. 1, 2, 3.
When Keeney got to picture 11, the first thing that came to his mind was Dina knows. What at first seemed an innocuous cliffside stroll revealed upon closer examination the terrifying moment before Dina's death.
At that lip, you can see Dina's shoes pointing toward the boulders, in toward the road, but you can see her head in a blur, turning as she realizes her body is getting pushed that way. And as she looks, like you would if you were pushed, as she looks where she's going, the photo blurs. There are no features of her face at all. But her shoes still point to BJ, the guy she trusted.
Moments later, she would be dead. To Keeney's way of thinking, the bizarre and disturbing circumstances of Dina's death were leading to a single conclusion.
Once you know a 20-year-old dies with 55-year-old strangers at her side, and you know that those strangers bought a life insurance policy on her, in your heart, don't you believe that that's almost bound to be a murder?
Armed only with a handful of photos and a hunch, Keeney was a long way from proving murder. He knew he would need some help. In Louisville, Kentucky, Steve Keeney revisited Dina Wild's autopsy report, looking for a shred of evidence to support his murder hypothesis. The Monterey coroner had determined the cause of Dina's death to be a skull fracture. He surmised that she lost her footing because of her high-heeled shoes. In his opinion, there was nothing suspicious about the circumstances of the so-called accident. Keeney wasn't so sure. He wondered if there was anything in the coroner's slim findings that suggested otherwise. Keeney brought the autopsy photos to forensic pathologist Barbara Weekley Jones. Could her analysis of the pictures differentiate a murder from an accident?
Steve Keeney was surprised when I told him some of the injuries were suggestive of not just an accidental death. Describe any on one hand.
The only fatal injury on Dina's body was a blow to the head, yet the right side of her body had linear scrape marks. To Weekley Jones, those lacerations suggested a limp slide, not a head-first plummet. Dina's bruised hands provided the most telling physical evidence. They hadn't sustained the kinds of injury typical in a fall. Her acrylic nails were snapped off, ragged, and embedded with granite, suggesting she'd clawed at the edge of the cliff, trying to save her life. Or perhaps she'd fought before she plunged to her death. In addition to the torn nails, both hands were marred by a very suspicious wound pattern.
But they had huge hematomas, black and blues, on the tops around her knuckles. Those you get when somebody steps on your hand, if you're holding the edge of a cliff.
Keeney wondered if Dina's broken skull was the result or the cause of her terrible fall. The top of the cliff sloped gently for the first few yards. If Dina had been trying to save herself, she no doubt would have grabbed at a rock or a tree root. But her palms showed no injuries, no signs of clutching at anything.
And look, she had fingernails. It looks like artificial fingernails.
Weekley Jones's findings substantiated Keeney's theory of an intentional push and a limp slide.
But that's not proof of homicide. So what else do you do? Well, the old phrase is, circumstances don't lie, people do.
There you go.
Keeney needed to take a close look at the suspects, Virginia and B.J. McGinnis.
Yeah. Well, they come up
Had
and
this
down
pleasant,
from
middle-aged
Mexico
couple
from
really
October
plotted to
to
do away with Dina?
February.
Were they truly capable of pushing their young friend off a 600-foot cliff?
Yeah, they spawn. That's what they do. That's
As he
a good
probed
word
the
for it.
backgrounds of his prime
Spawn.
suspects, Keeney uncovered a trail of death and deception. Virginia's rap sheet was a lot bloodier than Keeney had anticipated. Though the former nurse could affect a saccharine persona, her past suggested a cold, psychopathic profile that included compulsive lying, arson, and cruelty to animals. In addition to the accidental deaths of her daughter and second husband, Virginia's parents and several of her patients had died of unknown causes while in her charge. She frequently benefited from their life insurance policies. Keeney compiled this information into a lengthy report. It wasn't enough evidence to arrest Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, but it was enough to get the case reopened in California. Because the McGinnises had purchased Dina's insurance policy in San Diego, the district attorney's office in that jurisdiction became involved. Investigator Scott Lawrence took the baton from Steve Keeney. Like the Louisville attorney, he was compelled to make sense of Dina's fall. But Dina's case didn't have the benefit of much physical evidence. Lawrence attempted to disprove the theory of an accidental tumble by recreating Dina's trajectory. It was more than a year and a half after Dina's death, so any blood or geographic disturbance from her fall would have been washed away. The only thing Lawrence knew for sure was where she landed. What he needed to determine was where the fall started.
Well, one of the things that we had to look into was where we knew she was last standing at this turnout, almost within a few feet of where I'm at. That's based upon testimonial evidence as well as photographic.
Based on Lawrence's assessment, this wasn't a place where a person was likely to lose her footing, even in high-heeled shoes. The ground was relatively flat and solid. Now, Lawrence could recreate Dina's path down the cliff. Though he was a novice rock climber, his fierce commitment to the truth compelled him down the cliff face with a video camera in hand. From his topographic analysis, Lawrence believed that Dina was dead or near death when she lost her grip on the edge of the overlook. For one thing, the first section of the cliffside was not a sheer drop. Had Dina accidentally fallen here, she probably would have been able to stop her descent. She probably would have screamed. After the initial slope, the cliff drops off suddenly. Lawrence experimented to see how fast and by which route Dina was likely to have descended.
So we could take individual rocks and toss them down, and you get a pretty good idea of how you would accelerate once you got past the incline and once you made that first precipice about 40 or 50 feet down to my right, down toward the ocean.
Had Dina free-fallen off the precipice, she would have hit the bottom in excess of 120 miles per hour. Yet her body was in one piece, with no tumbling marks and relatively few fractures. Lawrence's research corroborated Weekly Jones's analysis of the body. Dina went down the cliff in a slow, limp slide, not an accelerating, high-speed tumble. Lawrence's careful recreation of the fall didn't jibe with the story relayed by the McGinnises.
So we tried many ways to interpret what could have happened, and the bottom line is there's always unknowns, and the people that know aren't talking.
By September of 1989, police gathered enough incriminating evidence to arrest the McGinnises. For the trial, the cliffside overlook was transformed into an outdoor courtroom. Scott Lawrence's careful recreation had a profound impact on the jury. The odyssey begun in Steve Keeney's office ended when the jury found Virginia McGinnis guilty of conspiracy, first-degree murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and murder for financial gain. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. B.J. McGinnis had died of pneumonia before the trial began. The inconsistencies in the so-called accidental death of Dina Hubbard Wild had been untangled to reveal a cold-blooded murder, despite the fact that neither the body nor the crime scene had been preserved. For experts hoping to solve old murders, keen analysis of the meager traces left behind means the difference between overdue justice and a death that is forever lost in time. For 7 years, Susan Davis endured an unsatisfying marriage with a struggling insurance salesman named Ralph. Leaving was always on her mind, but she never got very far from their Columbia, Missouri home. Then, one evening in June 1985, after a long day at her secretarial job, she climbed into her Ford Escort and drove off, never to be seen again. When she failed to show up for work the next day or answer phone calls, her mother contacted the police. Officers from the Boone County Police Department questioned relatives and searched the Davis home, but found nothing to indicate that Susan had been taken against her will.
Yes, I'm so worried.
Some people believed Susan's departure was her way of making a clean break from a life that had gotten too painful and messy. At the time of her disappearance, Susan had finally succeeded in making some big changes. She'd separated from Ralph and sent her 2 children, Robbie and Angela, to live with her parents in Iowa.
And what was his occupation?
Perhaps she was starting her life over in some other part of the country. Captain Larry McCrae led the investigation.
Ralph Davis told us that when Susan disappeared that she had a boyfriend and she'd probably gone off to Texas and someday she'd show back up.
Susan was officially declared a missing person. In her absence, Ralph moved back into the house, brought his children home from their grandparents, and settled into the life of a single father. The family waited in vain for Susan's return. As his finances dwindled, Ralph went to court to make sure that if Susan did resurface, she'd be compelled to pay him child support. But there were still no clues as to her whereabouts and diminishing hope that she'd ever return. But as McCrae came to realize, Ralph Davis's victimized spouse routine was a feeble charade. The more he probed police files, the more McCrae came to realize what an abusive husband Ralph had been. For the duration of their marriage, Susan had lived in the wake of Ralph's ferocity. Then, one night in 1985, a few months before her disappearance, she'd reached the breaking point. Fearing for her life and the safety of her children, she garnered the strength to call the police. Ralph was arrested.
We investigated a case where Ralph had beat her up. We'd photographed, and at that time, there was an ex parte on her, which says, Ralph, you cannot go back to your home. You have to stay away from Susan and the kids.
A short stay in jail did little to calm Ralph. He had been boiling mad when he was released on bail. Then Susan disappeared. Ralph's violent tendencies gave credence to the theory that Susan had left him and covered her trail to ensure her safety. But for McCrae, the pieces still weren't adding up. Why hadn't this devoted mother contacted her children? Why hadn't she checked in with her frantic mother to let her know that she was all right? McCrae suspected he was looking at something more ominous than a woman in search of a happier life. McCrae believed that Ralph Davis wasn't telling the whole story. But without any evidence, the police had no course of action. There was no body. There were no leads. Even Susan's car had disappeared. McCrae's only option was to dig in and hope that one day a clue would surface. He didn't imagine that the waiting game would play out for so long. It had been 2 years since Susan Davis climbed into her car and vanished. Whether she left town intentionally or met a horrible fate remained an unanswered question. Captain McCrae's investigation met a dead end. Then one day, the owner of a storage facility took the locks off a unit rented by a customer who'd stopped paying his bills. Inside was a Ford Escort with the driver's side window blown in. The name of the delinquent customer was none other than Ralph Davis.
That's McCrae.
Captain McCrae was contacted. A quick run of the vehicle ID and tags confirmed it was Davis's car. McCrae took a look inside and was struck with a terrible sight.
When we approach the car and we look inside of it, we're pretty sure that somebody died in that car.
Blood and tissue spattered the dashboard, seats, and visors. Glass shards mingled with spent bullet shells on the car floor. 2 feeble air fresheners added a grim irony to the grisly scene. After 2 years of sitting on his hands, McCrae could finally move in on his prime suspect, Ralph Davis. Davis came up with a story to explain away the car. Before blowing out of town, he said, Susan had paid him one last visit. She was armed. Ralph overpowered her, pulled her out of the car, and climbed behind the wheel. As he drove away, he claimed, Susan smashed the window with her arm, bloodying the glass. The implausible account did little to explain how bits of body tissue got into the car. Davis was arrested. Experience told McCrae that he'd just detained a brutal murderer, but proving that in court would be another matter, especially when the crime scene was 2 years old. A successful forensic investigation would take a two-pronged approach. First, McCrae's team would have to establish that a murder had in fact taken place in the car, and secondly, they'd have to identify the victim. McCrae believed he was looking at the remains of Susan Davis, but he was a long way from proving it. From the pattern of blood in the car, preliminary crime scene reconstruction determined that the victim had been shot inside the vehicle.
On the floor of the car, we found glass, basically moving inward, which would indicate that a shot or something had gone through that and from the outside. As we looked at the glass, we found that the glass was on the floorboard, and on top of the glass was blood.
It seemed that the shot came through the window, striking the driver in the head. The force sent the victim toward the other side of the car, crashing first into the rear-view mirror hard enough to crack the windshield. From the amount of blood and brain tissue found in the car, the medical examiner determined that someone had died here. The automobile was towed to a private storage lot where McCrae's team could try to make sense of the disarray. Because they didn't know what was evidence, they erred on the side of caution and collected everything.
Do you see, is there something back over, see back over?
Armed with specialized tools, apparel, and collection bottles, the investigators began to take the car apart, piece by piece, carefully cataloging each fragment of bone, tissue, and each smear of blood. Bullets were dislodged from the interior of the car. They matched shotgun shells found in Ralph Davis's home. A vacuum with sterile filters was used to collect the tiniest pieces of evidence. Like high-tech car vandals, the team stripped the Escort down to the bare bones, bagging everything from the steering wheel to the carpeting for further analysis. At the University of Missouri's Human Skeletal ID Lab, bits of debris, some metal, some glass, some unidentified, were delivered in a matchbox to anthropologist Sam Stout. If human bone fragments were present in the jumbled findings, Stout would know how to unlock their secrets.
My work as an anthropologist was probably important in this case because as anthropologists we're often called upon to analyze bone specimens. We're probably the most familiar with pieces of bone, fragments of bone, whether it be a 2 million year old fossil to a modern cemetery.
33 fragments, none longer than a quarter inch, were separated into little plastic caps.
Bone specimens to embed in plastic and then we'll,
Because the findings were so small, it was nearly impossible to determine by sight whether they were bone. To be sure, Stout needed to examine the samples under a microscope. First, they needed to be prepared for viewing. To make slides, Stout's assistant embeds each fragment in plastic. As the air in the vacuum chamber is drawn away, the plastic impregnates the sample, then hardens. The embedded specimen is cut into slices as thin as cellophane. Each slice is then smoothed and placed on a glass slide for viewing. Microscopic analysis of the cross-sections told Stout that he was in fact looking at human bone. Stout knew where the fragments came from, a human skull. Dr. Stout had determined that the meager scrapings from the floor of Susan Davis's car were in fact human facial bones. Now he wanted to see if there was anything unique about the bone fragments that could tie them to Susan Davis and her death. Stout noticed that there were some smudges on the bone fragments. He sent them to the geology department at the University of Missouri lab. A scanning electron microscope revealed that traces of lead had been embedded in the bone. The presence of antimony indicated that gunpowder was involved as well. This victim had been shot. The close scrutiny of these fragments was turning the cloudy details into a vivid portrait of murder. But how could Stout link the bone to Susan Davis? Stout noticed an odd characteristic. Beyond the lead smudges was another lighter discoloration in the bone. In Stout's experience, that pattern indicated that the victim had been taking tetracycline. To test for the antibiotic, he exposed the bone to fluorescent light. If the drug were present, the bone would glow.
We saw the actual fluorescing of tetracycline, and upon seeing that, I suggested that they examine the records to see if Susan Davis had a prescription for tetracycline.
Dr. Stout estimated that the victim had been taking the drug for at least 3 months before death. McCrae knew from the original search of Susan's home that she'd been prescribed tetracycline at the time of her death. Stout had shown that the remains in the car were from the face of a person who was taking tetracycline. But McCrae needed irrefutable proof that this was Susan Davis. Without it, Ralph Davis would likely go free.
The missing link was, whose body was it? We all felt that it was Susan, but that's not evidence that you can take to court.
No murderer in the state of Missouri had ever been convicted without a body, so McCrae had a double burden. Before he could prove that Ralph Davis was a killer, he'd have to prove that Susan Davis was the victim. The finishing touches of the investigation would have to be drawn in blood. Could bloodstains link a 2-year-old crime scene to the death of Susan Davis? It was forensic serologist Lori Maloney's job to find out. Carpeting, sun visors, and upholstery from the interior of the car were sent to her at the Missouri State Highway Patrol lab. If she could determine that blood on these items came from Susan Davis, it would be nearly impossible for Ralph Davis to evade prosecution. But, as Maloney knew, irrefutable victim identification is tricky business. She needed to run a series of tests to find out exactly whose blood this was. Above all, she needed to be precise to check and cross-check her results. Maloney's first task was to swab the samples to make sure that the stains found in the car were truly blood. The test turns green when blood is present. Maloney then needed to confirm that the blood was human. She added human antibody to the samples. When human blood and human antibody come in contact, they react, forming a thin white line. Maloney's results were consistent with McCrae's theory that someone had been killed in the vehicle.
I found on the evidence human blood detected on the carpeting and the seat belt latches. Also, I found human protein on the sun visors.
But how could she prove that the remains had come from Susan Davis? She had no samples of Susan's blood or tissue to compare them with. Paternity tests are commonly used to establish a man's parenthood by comparing his DNA with that of the child and its mother. By applying that standard procedure in a creative new way, a reverse paternity test, Maloney hoped to simulate Susan Davis's genetic profile. Every child gets half his DNA from his mother, half from his father. Subtracting DNA bands that the father and child have in common leaves a barcode representing the mother's genetic signature.
The remaining bands would then be used to compare to the crime scene evidence, and if those were matching to the crime scene evidence, the blood could have originated from the mother, Susan Davis.
Using this procedure, Ralph Davis's DNA pattern was subtracted from his children's. The resulting bands were a close simulation of Susan Davis's genetic fingerprint. This banding pattern matched the samples found on the Ford Escort's carpet. Susan Davis had been killed in her car. The ghostly fingerprint of a woman who'd vanished years earlier was returning to solve her murder.
What I think happened to Susan Davis was that she was going to leave this area to some safe haven because of Ralph's harassing her, stalking, and she was packing her car, backed up to the front of the house, loading her clothes in it when Ralph came around the house. She saw Ralph, got in the car, locked it up, and Ralph came up and shot her through the driver's side window.
Thanks to astute forensic analysis and an exacting recreation of the grisly death scene, prosecutors convinced the jury that Ralph Davis had killed his estranged wife in her car. It was a landmark decision in Missouri, one that saw Ralph Davis get the death penalty, even though the whereabouts of his victim is a mystery to this day. In the Susan Davis case, investigators had to revisit a crime that happened 2 years earlier without the benefit of a body. In Canada, investigators faced a similar but even stranger challenge: to determine what killed a woman 3,000 years ago. They had the body, but to touch it would be to destroy it. At the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, a mummy named Jedame-Sank, or Jed, has stood in silent vigil for decades. Her secrets wrapped tightly inside her delicate sarcophagus. Museum visitors and scientists alike are fascinated by her mysterious beauty and eager to know more about how she lived and died. From the elaborate drawings on her cartonnage, the shell of linen and glue in which her mummy is encased, we know only scattered details of her life. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Jed, a musician at the Temple Amun-Re, lived a prosperous life on the east bank of the Nile.
The soul that she will not want.
Ancient Egyptians celebrated life after death, but it could only be attained if they departed this world in the prescribed fashion. The journey to the land of the gods would be strenuous and dangerous. In order for the soul to survive the trip, the body needed to be strong. Mummification was the answer. A marriage of science and religion, the mummification process followed a strictly detailed procedure that took approximately 10 weeks to complete. After death, the body was cleansed and anointed. A single slit was made in the abdomen. Then the internal organs were removed and preserved in jars. Natron, a powdery drying agent made up of salt and sand, was heaped over the body. In the arid heat of the Egyptian sun, the body would completely desiccate in 40 days. The skin was rubbed with oils and resin to keep it supple. Linen stuffing was inserted in the body cavities to maintain lifelike contours. The corpse was adorned with makeup and funerary jewelry. Then the arduous task of wrapping began. In an effort to know more about these ancient people, many researchers, like pediatrician Peter Lewin, have found themselves compelled to unwrap the mysterious packages.
In the olden days, we would break up this casket, tear off the bandages of the individual inside who's mummified, break up the tissues to examine genetic material, chemistry, and any diseases, and in essence destroy a mummy, which is invaluable to humanity.
Lewin grew up in Egypt and has maintained a lifelong fascination with mummies. Today, in addition to his work at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, he is a leading researcher in the field of paleopathology.
Paleopathology is really the study of diseases of ancient man, and that can be done by examining the bodies themselves, and also can be done by the latest use of X-ray technology.
How could Dr. Lewin see into the life of this mummy and learn why she died without desecrating the sanctity of her death? X-ray technology, known as computerized axial tomography, or CT scanning, was the answer to Lewin's dilemma. The machine produces cross-sectional images of the body without touching it. When the slices are stacked together, a three-dimensional image is rendered. Dr. Lewin was assisted by CT technician Stephanie Holoka. Lewin, who pioneered the use of the technique to slice into mummies without using a knife, first scanned Jed in 1978. But the technology was in its infancy, and he was barely able to distinguish the ancient body from the dense packing material. Nearly 20 years later, he was ready to try again. Because the patient was already dead, Holoka didn't need to worry about radiation levels. That freedom enabled her to take numerous pictures at very small increments. She scanned the body in 5mm slices and went to 3mm increments for the head and neck. Even greater detail was used to image the ears and eyes. 300 two-dimensional images were taken during the 4 hours of scanning. Glimpses of Jed came through in these X-rays, but it wouldn't be until they were stacked together that the ancient woman would truly come to life. Once the meticulous scanning was completed, it was finally time for the mummy to show herself. A computer compiled the pictures into a 3D rendering, but the quality was poor. In living patients, bone is dense and shows up white. Fat, flesh, and skin are gray. Liquid is black. In Jed's body, the bones had lost minerals and become softer, while the soft tissue had toughened. Instead of a high-contrast image, Jed was showing up only in shades of gray. This low-contrast problem meant that Holoka would have to painstakingly render the images slice by slice. Imaging the skull in a live patient takes 10 minutes. It took Holoka 3 hours to reconstruct Jed's skull and hundreds of hours to render the entire body. Holoka was then able to electronically peel away the layers. After removing the outermost layer of cartilage, she arrived at the linen wrapping that surrounded the head. Gray circles showed up over the eye sockets. The Egyptians inserted plates behind the lids to keep the features from sinking. Holoka also noticed that in keeping with the ritual, Jed's brain had been removed and her skull stuffed with linen. Finally, the image of a small, young woman appeared. Based on the pattern of bone fusion, Jed was estimated to be 30 to 35 years old when she died.
And the first thing I thought when I saw her skull, after doing a lot of 3D imaging on various skulls, is that she must have been a very pretty lady. She had very high cheekbones and she had a very well-defined chin.
Holoka had used CT technology to excavate the mummy. Now, Lewin wanted to know what killed her. Could he determine cause of death 3,000 years after the fact? Lewin examined the 3D image of Jed's skull. He noticed a strange black shape on the left jawbone. The gaping hole, he realized, was an enormous abscess. Hard as it is to believe, Jed had died from dental disease. Ancient Egyptians were prone to dental disease because of their sandy, coarse diet and their love for sweets. In Jed's case, the outer enamel on 24 of her 28 teeth had worn away, exposing the sensitive dental pulp and the root. Exposed roots are acutely painful. They also become infected easily. Jed's infection was spread from the root canal to the bone, where it caused several abscesses. Lewin surmised that the large pus-filled cyst probably burst, spreading infection throughout her body and poisoning her blood. It was probably an agonizingly painful, drawn-out death.
She probably died a very, very miserable death due to genital infection, which originated from this basically dental abscess of her left upper jaw.
In life, this beautiful musician from Thebes endured agonizing pain. In death, thanks to the pioneering efforts of Dr. Lewin's team, she has finally achieved the kind of celebrated and dignified afterlife her culture held so dearly.
With this type of imaging, really, we have pioneered the use of that sort of technology which is non-destructive and which gives us tremendous information in relation to diseases of ancient man.
Because Jedame-Sank had been so carefully preserved, time didn't stand in the way of science. Detectives who lure truth from the murky past are constantly fighting against the ravages of time. Today, science is their greatest ally in that battle. Armed with the latest techniques, forensics experts are winning the war against time, liberating lost and forgotten voices from beyond the grave. In Miami, it looks like a burglary gone wrong. At least that's what the murderer hoped. But to detectives, the clues reveal the truth. A man dies in the flames of his burning truck. But the real crime scene is miles away. Can forensics prove that connection? Investigators grapple with a double homicide. The sole eyewitness reports the victims were killed by a ninja assassin. Some kill out of hatred. Some do it for love. But for others, murder is all in a day's work. Their services are available to anyone willing to pay the price for their deadly dealings. In the early morning hours of March 7th, 1986, police received a call from the home of Stan and Joyce Cohen in Coconut Grove, Florida. At 5:25 a.m., Joyce had frantically dialed 911, reporting that an intruder had entered their home. Her husband was shot in his sleep. Stan Cohen, a 52-year-old owner of a construction company, had been shot 4 times in the head.
Tell me, is
He was pronounced dead at the scene.
Husband, can you tell me anything?
Homicide detectives were called in. Leading the investigation was John Spear.
When I arrived at the scene, I met Joyce Cohen. There were only 2 people in the house, according to Joyce Cohen, when this homicide occurred. Now, my teachings and my beliefs are when you have 2 people in a house or a room or anywhere, and one of them ends up dead, you should suspect the other person until your suspicions are relieved.
This right here?
But suspicions can only take an investigator so far, and they ultimately mean nothing in a court of law. The truth is told through the evidence. Meantime, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy on Stan Cohen. He ruled gunshot as the official cause of death. He was told the victim was killed between 5:15 and 5:20 that morning. He had no reason to question it.
Could we have a seat right here, please?
While the forensics team swarmed the Cohen's house,
I get you to put your hands on the table, ma'am.
Joyce went to the police station.
Ma'am, this is,
She agreed to a routine swab test for gunpowder residue.
What I'm going to do is swab your hand, and if there's any shots or traces of gunshot residue.
While awaiting the results, she gave her statement. According to Joyce, she and Stan were awakened by a noise downstairs.
I think I heard something.
Stan picked up his gun, and the two went to investigate. A quick search of the house showed nothing amiss. Relieved, the couple returned to bed. But Joyce claimed she couldn't sleep, so she went back downstairs. At approximately 5 a.m., a friend called from Colorado. As they were talking, she heard a noise in the kitchen. She noticed the glass in the kitchen door was broken. She said she hung up from her friend. Then she saw a figure running downstairs and out the door. She ran upstairs to check on Stan. She found him bleeding in bed. She couldn't rouse him.
Oh my God, what happened?
She dialed 911.
Honey, are you okay? Are you okay?
When I advised her that there were some inconsistencies in this particular story that she told me about the homicide, it irritated her.
She demanded that the forensics team immediately leave her house and not return without a search warrant. She said she didn't want any of her husband's things taken or touched. Detective Spear couldn't understand her hostile reaction.
Now, if a loved one of mine or anybody else that I would know was killed, I think they would cooperate 100% with the police. To me, she was not cooperating.
To Spear, it seemed she knew more than she was letting on.
The only thing we can do is
I got some lady captain.
Until the warrant was issued, investigators were locked out of Cohen's house. 4 hours later, the paperwork came through. Joyce Cohen was presented with the warrant, and the team swung back into action. They went inside to dust for fingerprints. Joyce was called back to the police station to continue her interrogation. By now, the residue tests on her hands had come back from the lab. They were positive, showing she'd had contact with gunpowder. She calmly provided detectives with an explanation.
When she discovered her husband's body in the bed, she grabbed him and a pillow. And possibly that's what caused her to have the gunshot powder residue on her hands.
Investigators made a note of her response and pressed on. They noticed that her story changed slightly from her first interview.
Hey, thanks for calling.
Now, instead of saying that her friend called from Colorado at 5 a.m., she said it was closer to 3 a.m. That left a gap of 2 hours between the time of the break-in and her call to 911. Slips like that can mean nothing, or everything. It was too early to tell. The evidence was still being gathered. Outside the house, police discovered a gun in the garden. It was taken to the Miami Police Crime Scene Investigations Unit, where it was examined by Technical Supervisor Sylvia Romans. After photographing the weapon, she tried to raise fingerprints.
Upon fuming the gun, I found some evidence of fingerprints. They weren't of much value, but the most significant thing that I found was that it appeared the gun had been wiped down.
Ballistics showed that it was the weapon that killed Stan Cohen. Because it was one of the victim's own guns, it seemed like a dead end. Except it bore one tiny clue. Romans found a shred of paper facial tissue caught between the frame and the grip. It suggested the gun had been wiped clean with a tissue. It also suggested another clue to look for. Samples of facial tissue were collected from around the house. In a trash can in the back bathroom down the hall from the murder scene, detectives found a soiled tissue with black residue on it. It was sent to the lab.
The lab was not able to determine whether, in fact, the tissue that was found on the gun was an exact match to the tissue that I had submitted to the lab. However, the tissue did have gunshot residue, and it also had the mucuses of Joyce Cohen.
Blood in the nasal mucus matched Joyce Cohen's blood type. It strongly suggested that Joyce had shot her husband, then wiped down the gun with this tissue. But facial tissue makes flimsy evidence. To win his case, Speer needed something more substantial. What he got was a confession from someone who wasn't even a suspect. In the case against Joyce Cohen, Miami police were hampered by lack of solid evidence. But 1 month after Stan Cohen was murdered, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A career burglar named Frank Maglione was arrested for a separate crime. He knew about the Cohen murder and wanted to strike a deal.
We learned that he and 2 other companions assisted in this homicide and were paid to do this homicide by Stanley Cohen's wife, Joyce Cohen.
Maglione knew things that only someone involved could have known. So it was clear he was telling the truth. But even this startling confession didn't assure Joyce Cohen's conviction. On the stand, it would come down to the words of a grieving widow versus the testimony of a career criminal. Feeling he didn't have enough evidence to get a conviction, Speer spent 2 years chasing the other men Maglione implicated. But they wouldn't crack. He had to rely solely on Maglione and the forensic evidence to prove Joyce Cohen's involvement. According to Maglione, Joyce met him and the others at a restaurant to plan the hit. Joyce had it all mapped out. It was supposed to look like a burglary gone bad. They were to arrive at the house between 2 and 3 a.m. and use Stan's own gun to kill him. Maglione's story had one nagging inconsistency: the time of the hit.
So they can make friends.
Phone records showed that Joyce called 911 after 5 a.m., not 3 a.m. They also showed that her friends called from Colorado shortly before the 911 call, around 5. It didn't make sense for Joyce to wait 2 hours to call police, and yet 3 a.m. is also the time Joyce gave in her second statement. What seemed like a possible slip of the tongue suddenly became pivotal to the case. Police suspected that Joyce may have waited in order to create her alibi. They followed that lead. They learned that a guest at a neighbor's house was awakened on the night of the murder by what sounded like gunshots. He recalled looking at the clock. It was around 3 a.m. The information supported Spear's theory, but even this report was nothing more than circumstantial. To truly determine the time of death, he needed the testimony of the victim, Stanley Cohen. Originally, the medical examiner had no reason to doubt the time of death according to Joyce Cohen, and listed it at 5:30. Now, determining the time of death was more tricky. The body had long since been buried. All that remained were photos taken upon its arrival at the medical examiner's office. Hours after death, blood settles in the lowest portions of the body in a process called lividity. The pooling blood creates telltale red marks. From the extent of the lividity marks, a medical examiner can estimate the time of death.
7 by 5 centimeters.
Joyce Cohen's lawyers hired an expert witness who requested copies of the autopsy photos. He determined there was no lividity when the pictures were taken, meaning the victim was killed shortly after 5 a.m., as Joyce originally asserted. But because the defense was viewing second-generation reprints of the photos, the subtleties of the images were lost. Testifying for the prosecution, the medical examiner went back to his original photographs. The lividity was apparent, meaning the victim was killed around 3 a.m. Joyce had waited 2 hours to call the police, proving she was part of the conspiracy to kill her husband. Maglione's testimony put into question the time of death. The autopsy photos confirmed his story. The forensics work on the scrap of facial tissue further proved Joyce Cohen's connection to her husband's murder. At the prearranged time, Maglione and his team arrived at Cohen's house. She was awake and let them in. They already knew where to find Stanley's gun. They went to the bedroom, shot him 4 times, then ran out. On the way, they dropped the gun. Joyce picked it up, wiped it down with the tissue, and threw it out the window into the garden. She then perhaps blew her nose on the tissue and disposed of it in the far bathroom. Although it was never proven, she may have arranged with her friends in Colorado to call her, thereby establishing her alibi. Unfortunately, the friends called too late, or there was some confusion over the time zones, Colorado being 2 hours earlier than Florida. Her own alibi betrayed her. Joyce Cohen received 40 years for murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Frank Maglione received 10 years. The co-conspirators were also rounded up and received sentences of no less than 39 years. Murderers are optimists, always believing they can get away with it. But reality has a way of catching up with them, one fact at a time. On a sleepy Saturday morning in August 1988, a driver on a rural road outside of Oklahoma City was startled by the sight of a burning truck. He got out to take a better look. Curiosity turned to horror when he saw the body of a man lying on the driver's side of the cab, his leg dangling out of the open door. After the fire department quenched the blaze, Oklahoma City police investigated the scene.
Wow, look at this, Joyce.
Yes.
The vehicle was annihilated. A man was dead.
Hey, Mark, can you come over and take some pictures of that?
Back here, a lot of evidence. But the guy from the gas tankers.
While police traced the vehicle to determine who the victim was, the sheriff's department received a call from a woman whose husband hadn't returned from work. Marilyn Plants, an Oklahoma City housewife, told the sheriff that her husband Jim, a newspaper press room supervisor, should have been home 2 hours ago. She was distraught. It wasn't like him to be late. Marilyn said that she'd last seen her husband at dinner the night before. It was just like any other evening. After the meal, he went off to work.
Oh, cool. Can I take some to work?
He mentioned nothing about having to stay late. The make and model of Jim Plantz's truck matched the burned vehicle. Later, dental records proved the victim was indeed Jim Plantz. City officials were left with the sorry task of telling Marilyn Plantz that her husband had died in a horrible accident. But investigators weren't entirely convinced it was an accident. A spot of blood found on the road behind the truck raised questions. From the condition of the truck itself, investigators quickly ruled out mechanical failure or a cigarette mishap as the source of the fire. Lieutenant Ralph Gibson led the investigation.
We found that there was a rag, cotton rag, partially burned in the gas tank, indicated like someone tried to set it on fire to blow it up. The actual fire was so hot that gasoline or something in that order was used, that it burned so hot that the glass actually melted in the vehicle.
The ferocity of the blaze gave investigators reason to suspect that the truck was intentionally torched. The autopsy fueled those suspicions. It revealed that Plantz suffered head trauma and broken forearms, but his truck showed no signs of collision, suggesting he was beaten, then placed into the vehicle. The gases in his lungs showed he was still alive when the truck was set ablaze. The case officially became a homicide. To find the killer, Gibson first needed to find the motive. Gibson learned from Plantz's employer that the victim had recently increased his company life insurance from $50,000 to $290,000. He had a separate policy for an additional $20,000. Dead, Jim Plantz was worth more than $300,000.
The increase in insurance definitely got my attention as a motive for a homicide.
Well, sure.
The beneficiary of the money was Jim's wife, Marilyn Plantz. It didn't seem likely that the young mother would be strong enough to beat her husband to the threshold of death and then drag him into his truck. Investigators asked her the routine questions about the state of her marriage, her financial situation, any enemies her husband may have had. Her answers were equally routine. No motives or enemies came out of the conversation. It began to look as though Plantz may have been the victim of a random act of violence. Gibson persisted in the investigation.
As I routinely do when I work homicides, I do a background investigation on the victim and associates and their vehicles. Upon checking Marilyn Plance's vehicle, I determined that it was stopped about a week prior.
Driving the car was a man named Clifford Bryson. Marilyn Plance was the passenger. Police wanted to know if they witnessed the theft of a pickup truck that just occurred. Bryson said he thought he recognized the driver. It was a man named Roderick Ferris. With nothing else to go on, investigators followed this tenuous lead and decided to talk to Ferris. They didn't have far to go. Ferris was in the city jail, charged with stealing the truck. Perhaps he'd be willing to swap information for a more lenient sentence.
I asked him, did he know Marilyn Plance? And he said, yes, he did know Marilyn. He said, what's strange, she offered him $10,000 to kill her husband. He claimed that, and since he was in the city jail, he had no knowledge that he had been murdered.
Thanks to Ferris, the cast of characters in this deadly drama began to be revealed. Ferris said Marilyn made the same offer to Clifford Bryson. He said that Bryson and Marilyn were having an affair. Bryson was called in for questioning, and the finger-pointing continued. At first, Bryson claimed to have limited knowledge about the incident. But as the interrogation continued, he admitted that he knew about it beforehand. He wasn't involved, he said. The man they were after was named Clinton McKimble. Bryson was arrested as an accomplice. In short order, Clinton McKimble was also brought in, questioned, and arrested.
He admitted that both he and Bryson were the participants, that they were solicited by Marilyn Plance to kill Marilyn's husband, Jim. They waited inside the house, beat him with baseball bats unconscious, took him to 50th and Sooner, and set him afire.
When the smoke cleared, Gilbert had confessions from the murderers, but he had only their word that Marilyn was the mastermind. Unless he could find some physical evidence to back that up, she would go free. Police had every reason to suspect that Marilyn Plance planned her husband's murder. Problem was, they couldn't prove it. Confronted by police, she denied everything. A search warrant was served on her house, the alleged scene of the crime. Investigators pulled back what looked like a new area rug. It concealed spots and bleach stains on the wall-to-wall carpet below. They cut the carpet, revealing what resembled blood stains soaked into the padding. It was collected for testing in the lab. Tiny telltale spatters on the draperies and wall also were collected. In the child's bedroom closet, 2 stained baseball bats were found. Bryson told police that after they burned the truck, they returned to Marilyn's house. Because their clothes were covered with blood, Marilyn gave them the victim's clothes to wear. They bundled their own clothes in a bag and disposed of them in a creek a half-mile from the Plance's home. To corroborate Bryson and McKimble's story, the creek was searched for evidence.
The odds of finding this evidence were actually against us because we had several days of rain and the creek had swelled.
The diligent team managed to find the clothing. The evidence from the creek and the Plance home was bagged, tagged, and sent to the DNA serology laboratory of the Oklahoma City Police.
Carpet in, we're going to get the washcloth and change.
There, each piece was scrutinized to see if it contained blood, and if that blood matched that of Jim Plance. Only then would Bryson and McKimble's account be proved. The outcome of the case rested on the shoulders of forensic chemist supervisor Joyce Gilchrist.
Oh, great, thanks.
but some of the evidence didn't look hopeful.
I was very surprised that when the evidence was submitted to our laboratory from the clothing that was taken from a creek, the request was made by Detective Gibson for me to see if I could find any blood stains on the clothing.
Cold running water is the best way to remove blood stains. The clothing had been in the current for over a week. Gilchrist was fighting the odds. She knew the chances of detecting blood, let alone typing it, would be slim. To find traces of blood, Gilchrist used luminol, which makes blood stains glow in the dark. The luminol solution must be mixed just before use and applied right away. It was sprayed onto the jeans, then the lights were extinguished. The faint glow provided a glimmer of hope. The blood hadn't washed away. Now she had to see if its proteins were intact enough to identify whose it was. Before the advent of DNA testing, investigators relied on blood typing, which is less precise. To determine the blood type on the evidence, Gilchrist used a technique called absorption illusion. Bloodied threads from the jeans were glued into small wells using ordinary nail polish. Then human antiserum was added. It was incubated overnight under controlled temperature. Next day, the blood was tested for its type, A, B, or O. Surprisingly, the tests on the blood were a success. Despite its time underwater, the blood was in good enough condition to reveal that it was type A, the same as Jim Plance's. The results were encouraging, but not conclusive, because type A blood is shared by millions of people. To be certain the blood was the victim's, it was subjected to a more complex test for enzymes specific to his blood. The chances of anyone else having the same set of enzymes are slim. Proteins are added to the samples. Drawn across by an electric current, the samples react, creating light and dark bands. If the bands on the sample matched the bands created by the victim's blood, Gilchrist could be certain the unknown sample is Plance's blood. She had a match. The blood on the jeans was undeniably the victim's. This part of the killer's story checked out.
They did such a good job of wrapping the garments that they protected that blood for us, so that when it went into the water, the blood was protected from being washed away by the water itself. And when the items were found by our investigators and then brought back to the laboratory to be analyzed, I could make an association back to the victim very easily.
According to Bryson and McKimble, the murder occurred at Plance's house. The blood evidence collected there suggested this was so. It was Gilchrist's job to prove it beyond a doubt. The blood collected from the carpet, walls, and drapery were not as conspicuous as the blood on the clothing, but the tiny droplets were in much better shape. The same tests were performed on these samples. The results came quickly. The blood belonged to Jim Plance. The murder had obviously occurred in the Plance's home, just as Bryson and McKimble had said. Now, Gibson had to prove that Marilyn Plance knew about it. She was called in for an interview.
She denied just about everything. That at first she didn't even know any of the other two participants, being Bryson and McKimble. Then during the interview, again, she changed the story to fit the facts as she learned that we knew more than what she thought.
Marilyn insisted that she was asleep until about 8 a.m. She never heard her husband come home, heard no commotion. If Bryson and McKimble killed the victim in her home, it was totally without her knowledge. Gibson had to prove that the new area rug wasn't the only thing lying in the Plance's home. He knew that Marilyn was trying to cover up her involvement in her husband's murder. The new rug could be his most damning piece of evidence.
I was trying to find a way to link her to the purchase of that rug because it was a new rug. So I checked with the manufacturer of the rugs, and they told me one of the primary carrier was Walmart. And there was a Walmart just a few blocks from Marilyn's house. So I got a subpoena for the bank records of Marilyn Plants. And when I went through the bank records, I found a check to Walmart on the day of the killing.
I've got the receipts right here.
Gibson visited the store manager, who retrieved the original receipt from Marilyn's purchase. The itemized document showed that on the date of the murder, she made 2 purchases: a soft drink and an area rug. The transaction occurred at 9:11 a.m.
This is a girl that just reported her husband missing, and she goes and buys a rug at 11 o'clock, over 11 minutes after her store opens. She didn't shop a whole lot either.
The purchase of the rug was proof that Marilyn Plants had full, willful knowledge of the murder of her husband. According to what police could discern, when Jim Plants came home from work that morning, Marilyn's lover, Clifton Bryson, and his friend, Clinton McKimball, were already there, waiting to bludgeon him with baseball bats. While Marilyn cleaned up the house, the 2 men put the victim's body into his truck. Drove it to a remote road, doused it with gasoline, and set it afire. The victim should have been dead, but he wasn't. He made one futile attempt to flee the flames. Then he was consumed. The truck should have exploded, destroying the evidence, but it didn't.
The 3 conspired to kill Mr. Plants for the insurance money. McKimball did it for $45,000 that he was promised his share. The other 2 were going to take the rest of the money, move to Texas, and live off this particular insurance proceeds.
Instead, Marilyn Plants and Clifton Bryson were sentenced to death. Clinton McKimball received life in prison. Many so-called perfect crimes are spoiled by the confessions of a participant. A single word from a reliable source can send a solid alibi crashing to the ground. It was the night of September 25th, 1985. Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, had drawn to a close. Vera and Gerald Woodman marked its passing at a dinner party at the home of Vera's sister in Bel Air, California.
Thank you.
After bidding goodnight to their hosts, the couple climbed into their car for the 15-minute drive to their condo in Brentwood. They didn't know that their movements were being watched, that they were heading into a trap. Gerald Woodman was a self-made man, earning his fortune with his plastics business. He and Vera were married 45 years and raised 3 sons and 2 daughters. Though he was 67 years old and had undergone bypass surgery, he was still energetic and refused to retire.
You make a right. Okay.
On his way toward wealth, Woodman had evidently made some enemies. The Woodmans pulled into their parking spot in the condo garage at about 10:30 p.m. But they never made it out of their car. The ringing gunshots drew the attention of one of the residents, who raced to see what the commotion was. He caught only a glimpse of a single figure shrouded in black as it vanished into the darkness. He called the police to describe what he'd seen. LA detectives Richard Crotzley and Jack Holder were assigned to the case. Holder knew it was going to be a tough one.
I received a call at home from my lieutenant, Ed Henderson. He advised me that we had a double homicide in the West Los Angeles part of LA, and that the suspect was described as a ninja warrior.
The media pounced on the image of a ninja assassin on the prowl in West LA. The description was bolstered by the discovery of bare footprints at the murder scene. But the murders relied more on firepower than martial arts. Investigators eventually surmised that the ninja garb was just a disguise, and the footprints were made by the witness. The media still clung to the ninja image. Gerald had been shot once at close range. Vera had been shot 2 times. Police found no shell casings, so they knew the weapon was a revolver. Ballistics determined it was a .357 Magnum, a uniquely powerful weapon. The motive for the crime wasn't immediately clear. Gerald still had his wallet. Vera still wore her jewels. Nothing in the car seemed to have been touched or taken. To Richard Crotzley, the crime smacked of a professional hit.
So, since no property was missing from either Vera or Gerald at that time, and it appeared that the robbery was not a motive, things crept into our mind that all of a sudden this could possibly be a murder for hire.
Because hired killers have no connection to the victim, they're harder to catch. And because the person who orders the killing can do it from a distance and has time to establish an alibi, he's harder to convict. Investigators needed to work the case from 2 angles. First, they would have to process all the evidence at the scene to catch the gunman. Then they'd have to compile a list of the woodman's enemies to find out who ordered the hit. They determined that the killers entered the garage by cutting a chain that secured a gate. Apparently, 2 pieces of chain link ended up in a nearby planter, where they were recovered. It wasn't a lot to go on, but detectives knew that if they did their job right, this tiny clue could be the first link in a chain of evidence that would lead to the killer. In West LA, 2 chain fragments were the only clues in the Woodman double homicide. They bore no fingerprints. They were brought to the LAPD's Scientific Investigations Division for further analysis. A low-power comparison microscope revealed that the scratches and imperfections on both pieces were continuous, showing they were 2 halves of the same link. The shape of the cut helped supervising criminalist Bill Llewellyn surmise the kind of tool used to make the cut.
I was further able to examine the pieces of chain link and determine that a tool that might have been used to cut the chain link would have been a bolt cutter.
While the physical evidence was being gathered, police looked for a motive for the killings. Neighbors had told police that Gerald Woodman was involved with racehorses and gambling. He might have gotten in over his head. A look into his gambling debts turned up nothing. In fact, he'd done well and had no outstanding debts. But another motive may have stood closer to home. Vera Woodman's daughter and sister had an interesting story to tell.
They immediately proceeded to tell us about the dispute that had arisen between Gerald and his 2 older sons, Neil and Stuart Woodman, involving the takeover of the family business by the sons. They were very intense and adamant that Neil and Stuart had killed their parents.
Gerald Woodman had built Manchester Products, his plastics company, from scratch. When he had a heart attack, he entrusted it to his sons, Neil and Stuart. At the helm, the sons wrested the majority stock away from their father, shutting him out. Gerald spent most of his savings trying to win the company back. The ensuing hatred split the family. Neil and Stuart were no longer welcome at family functions. Gerald and Vera were not allowed to see their grandchildren. Everyone police spoke to gave the same story about the animosity that centered around the Woodman boys. Finally, it was time to speak to them directly. The brothers agreed to meet investigators at their attorney's office.
Now, any time that you want to interview a family member regarding their parent's death, why in the world are you going to get an attorney? Right then and then, I think Jack and I decided these guys are involved. Now, how are we going to prove it?
While Crotsley and Holder pondered where to gather their next clue, it walked in the door. Two former LA cops who moonlighted as security guards paid police a visit. They said that a man named Steve Hommick, who was employed by Neil Woodman, had recently hired them to keep Gerald and Vera Woodman away from their grandson's bar mitzvah. The former police officers told investigators that Hommick had given them some harsh instructions.
We had been told that Mr. Hommick had made the statement during a breakfast meeting prior to the bar mitzvah that Neil had told Steve, what are you going to do if he comes around? And Steve had replied that he would waste him.
A background check on Steve Hommick revealed that he was a former LA cop who had been fired after less than 1 year on the force. He was now living in Las Vegas and was under FBI surveillance for drug trafficking. He and a business associate had flown from Las Vegas to LA the day before the killings and had returned to Vegas the day after. Placing Hommick in Los Angeles on the night of the murders was a start. But LA's a big city, and Hommick could have gone anywhere. Police learned that his brother, Robert Hommick, lived less than 4 miles from the crime scene.
We also discovered that Robert Hommick was involved in a traffic accident the night of the murders within a half a block of the murders.
This seemed like more than a coincidence. Hommick's accident took place in the alley behind the Woodman's condo. Robert Hommick's record also showed that 3 months before the murders, he had been questioned by police for apparently loitering around Vera and Gerald's building. It was the date of the Woodman's anniversary, one of the few times Vera Woodman left the condo.
On our friend Jesse.
Investigators suspected that the Woodman boys had hired the Hommicks to kill their parents. It would take more than the evidence at hand to prove it. Federal agents had already put traces on Steve Hommick's phone in Las Vegas. Many of the calls were to his brother, to the Woodman's sons' homes and office, and to payphones near their houses. Phone records for all of the suspects were analyzed. They showed a flurry of activity just before the murders.
And looking at those records and our records, we started putting everything together that there was all kinds of conversations linking these suspects to each other.
It was enough to obtain a search warrant for Steve Hommick's apartment. There they found copious diaries detailing his activities. But he gave everyone a nickname, wrote everything in code. Investigators were able to crack it. One of the things police learned from the diaries was that Stuart Woodman had hired Robert Hommick to burglarize his own house so he could collect on the insurance. He also stole and torched a company car for the same reason. If Hommick was involved with the murder for hire, he wasn't so rash as to write about it. But his books did suggest that his brother Robert was often his partner in crime. Investigators next served a warrant on Robert Hommick's apartment, 4 miles from the murder scene. There, they found a new pair of bolt cutters. Assuming that Robert Hommick wouldn't have traveled far to purchase the tool, detectives spoke to the clerk at the hardware store just down the street from his apartment. The clerk confirmed that the cutter could make short work of chain link, and she recognized Hommick from pictures detectives showed her. She had sold him the cutter. The bolt cutter was sent to the forensics lab to see if it was the tool that sheared the link outside the victim's parking garage. Bill Llewellyn focused his microscope on the minute scrapings, or stria, on the blades.
Essentially, they are the bolt cutter's fingerprint. They are present on that bolt cutter, and no other bolt cutter will have the same set of stri pattern.
What's really unusual about the bolt cutters in this case is they were virtually brand new, and you could actually see marks on the jaws of the bolt cutters where they had been used to cut the chain link, which made my job much easier in that I had a very small area in which to focus my examination for the stri patterns.
After examining the blade, Llewellyn used it to cut a small piece of lead. The soft metal became impressed with the blade's stria without damaging the tool's cutting surface. The stria on the lead was then compared with the stria on the chain link. From the comparison of the stria, Llewellyn could determine indisputably that this bolt cutter cut this link. The broken chain was the missing link that Holder needed. It bound Robert Hommick to the scene of the crime, while the phone records and diary entries connected him to the Woodman brothers. But without witnesses or motive, the case was far from being locked up. Investigators struggled for 6 months to build their case against the Hommicks and the Woodman brothers. And then came a break. One of the Hommick's partners was arrested for unrelated charges. To reduce his sentence, he confessed to being a lookout on the night the victims were killed. He said that the Woodman brothers ordered the hit. That left only the motive. On the surface, it seemed like the Woodman sons had already gotten what they wanted. They'd stolen their father's successful company out from under him. Why, except for sheer hatred, would they want to kill their parents? The fact was, under Neal and Stewart's control, the company started to falter badly. They were doctoring the books. According to Detective Holder, they were desperate.
They had milked the company for every cent they could. They were being audited by the banks, and they were about to go under, and they couldn't stand the thought of their father seeing them lose and go bankrupt.
Fired by hatred, motivated by greed, and doomed by incompetence, Neal and Stewart Woodman took their father's company and destroyed it. Vera Woodman had a $500,000 life insurance policy payable to the company. It wasn't enough to get Manchester Products out of debt, but it was the only hope the Woodman boys held. Holder and Crotsley, with the help of criminalist Bill Llewellyn, had their evidence in place and were ready to arrest and prosecute. Armed with phone records, journal entries, a henchman's confession, and the cut chain link, they were able to tell their story of murder for hire.
Was the first time that LAPD had put on a case where they used tool mark impressions as evidence.
The evidence was enough to convince the jury. For conspiracy to murder Vera and Gerald Woodman, Neal and Stewart Woodman received life in prison. Robert Hommick, life without parole, and Steve Hommick, death. There may be honor among thieves, but the same cannot be said of murderers. When the heat's turned up, confidences are broken, partners betrayed. And an assassin who's only in it for the money is willing to pay any price to save his own life. Once he agrees to bargain, it's up to forensics to determine the truth of his tale.
Becky! Rebecca?
Investigators find a clue they think will lead to a killer's front door, but instead find themselves heading down a blind alley. Now their most important evidence is withering before their eyes. When a man reports his wife missing, her abandoned car becomes the biggest clue, but it's the nosy neighbors who drive the investigation. 4 months into her marriage, a woman disappears, but when her body turns up, it's clear she was no runaway bride. Investigators must rely on flimsy evidence to bag her killer. For some lovers, marriage can be murder. Even though proving it may pose a challenge, killers can't divorce themselves from the consequences of their broken vows. In the early morning hours of December 28, 1995, Melinda and David McLean let themselves into the apartment of their sister-in-law, Becky Vargas. The telephone and electricity in her unit hadn't been switched on yet.
Rebecca?
Becky was separating from her husband and had just rented the Ogden, Utah apartment.
Becky?
She had told her husband, Stephen Vargas, that she was going to try to start organizing her belongings and would return in an hour or two. But that was several hours ago. Stephen had asked Melinda and David to check on her, since they lived nearby. Melinda, who was Stephen's sister and Becky's best friend, was glad to go. Though they didn't see Becky, all seemed quiet and safe, leaving them unprepared for what they found. Becky Vargas lay dead in the leaves outside the building. Even before the sun was up, the Weber County, Utah Crime Scene Investigation Unit began its day processing the murder scene. The victim's blouse had been pulled up. At first glance, the condition of her clothes made her appear to be the victim of a random sexual homicide. But a closer look revealed the story was not so simple. Criminalist Russ Dean thought the scene might have been staged.
It was as if her body had been moved from one location to another. Her arm was under her body as if she'd been dragged. Her coat was removed and was under her body. The leaves were bunched up in certain locations around her arms and legs. And there was no other obvious indication of any type of sexual assault.
In fact, though the victim had suffered a head injury, most of the blood had pooled at her feet, suggesting she'd been turned around. Whoever did this had apparently tried to throw off the investigators. The forensics team documented and collected a set of car keys, a cigarette lighter, fragments of blood-spattered leaves, and most significantly, the apparent murder weapon, a broken flashlight stained with blood and entangled with hair. They spent 6 hours sifting through every inch of the area before they were satisfied. They determined that although the body had been repositioned, the victim hadn't been moved far. The only blood found was just a few inches from where she lay. Because the blood-stained flashlight was the most compelling clue, it was analyzed first at the Utah State Crime Lab in Salt Lake City. Investigators could see that it had a partial fingerprint on it, stamped in blood. According to latent print examiner Scott Spute, a bloody fingerprint can be even better than a smoking gun.
When we have a bloody fingerprint, for example, it's the victim's blood, it's not her finger, it's someone else's finger on the evidence. It's a crucial pinpointing item of evidence in which we can identify someone being at that crime scene, leaving that bloody fingerprint behind at the scene as they left.
It would be bad practice to home in on that one print. The lab had to inspect the flashlight for additional prints. The obvious ones, and the ones that remained invisible. It required 2 separate processes. Bloodstains, because they're not oily, can flake or rub off. To fix them in place, the flashlight was heated to 100 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes.
After I heat it on, I then put a stain on there which is called amido black, which reacts to the blood and makes it very visible, and oftentimes brings out areas of blood that were invisible prior to treatment.
To develop the latent or unseen prints, the flashlight was exposed to superglue vapor. The adhesive bonds to the moisture on the print, creating a durable shell that exposes and preserves it. Then, a fluorescent dye is applied, which adheres to the superglue. The latent prints shine under ultraviolet light. Testing revealed no other blood-stained prints. The original one, along with the latent prints, would have to do. Once a suspect was isolated, investigators were confident that the bloody fingerprint was all they'd need. While the clues were being scrutinized, Melinda McLean and her husband David went to the police station to give their statements. Melinda told police that she'd been best friends with Becky Vargas for 14 years.
And then we went back.
Becky had been married to her brother, Stephen Vargas, for 9 of them, but it looked like their marriage was coming to an end.
Do you have any idea how things aren't going well?
As far as she knew, the
kids.
split was amicable.
But, you know, he's trying to work things out. Okay, no, I have a joke. Okay, there's a screw up.
Though Becky was having an affair that her husband, Stephen Vargas, may have suspected, there didn't seem to be a lot of tension between the couple. In fact, it was Stephen who had called the McLeans to look in on her after the police told him they had no officers available to check on his wife. David McLean, down the hall, told police a similar story. He said that Stephen Vargas had called him just before 11 p.m. the night before the murder.
Did Steve at all go over there?
Stephen was worried because she was away so long, and the apartment had no lights. He said that he and Melinda stopped by. Though Becky's car was in the driveway, there was no answer. They went to a window to see if everything was okay, but stopped when they heard moaning.
Yeah, she sounds busy.
They thought that perhaps her boyfriend was there, so they left. They went to a payphone to tell Stephen that everything was fine. They told him what they had heard, then they left.
Your wife said that you've been seeing the guy.
David told police that out of curiosity, they drove back to Becky's a short time later. Now they were surprised to see Stephen Vargas's Jeep parked out front. Soon he appeared from beside the building, got into the vehicle, and drove off. David said that they caught up with him. Stephen was wearing his bathrobe and slippers. He told them he wanted to check on Becky himself, but asked the McLeans not to tell anyone he was there. When David revealed this detail to the police, Melinda reluctantly admitted it was true. David told police that Stephen called them once more early the following morning. He said that Becky still wasn't home and asked them to check on her again. That's when they found her dead. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the lantern found at the scene wasn't the actual murder weapon, but it may have been used to subdue the victim. From the shape of the wound, she was apparently struck down with a hammer or something similar. No such object was located. The killer was clever enough to carry off or remove some of the most incriminating evidence. Authorities hoped he'd left enough behind. At the police station, investigators continued to talk with the McLeans. Their detailed story seemed to pivot on Stephen Vargas. Then it took a more provocative twist when the police dispatcher told Detective David Wheeloth that Vargas was on the phone, but he wasn't calling about his wife.
She said that he was on the phone inquiring about his sister and his brother-in-law, and if they were in fact at the police station. And I told the dispatcher, yeah, that's who we're in here talking to, and if she would ask him if he would mind coming down to the police station as well.
Police told him about Becky's murder and said that his in-laws were fine, but he might not be, because Melinda and David saw him at the murder scene. He admitted that he was there that night, just as the McLeans had said. He peeked in the window, but he heard and saw nothing. Because the window was right next to where the victim was found, Wheeloth didn't believe him.
If Steve had gone there to look and listen, I don't think it would have been likely that he would have not seen Becky lying just a few feet away.
His suspicious behavior and the eyewitness testimony by the McLeans was enough to get a warrant to search Stephen Vargas's Jeep and to collect his fingerprints and a blood sample.
Can you get a paper bag?
Investigators were after anything that could link him to the crime scene. They found nothing but minuscule fragments of leaves, and not even many of those.
Actually, I wish I could find my little...
The Jeep looked recently vacuumed. They collected what they could, then returned the vehicle to Vargas and sent him home. The forensics team hoped they wouldn't need to rely on the leaves. Now that they had Vargas's fingerprint, they could compare it to the ones from the flashlight. Most of the prints did, in fact, match Stephen Vargas. But that made sense. He owned it. So the only one that really mattered was the one stamped in blood. The bloody fingerprint had a shape called a tented arch. Of the three features of fingerprints, loops, arches, and whorls, arches are the least common, and tented arches are rarer still. Only 5% of the population has them. Stephen Vargas was among that group. But the fingerprint on the flashlight wasn't clear enough to make a definitive comparison. Vargas might have left it, and then again, maybe not.
I cannot say he did not leave that print behind. I can only say it's not enough to identify it positively.
They thought the flashlight would illuminate the killer. Without it, their hopes of solving the case looked considerably more dim. Investigators working to solve the Becky Vargas homicide saw their most promising piece of evidence rendered useless. According to Detective Wheeloff, a case that had looked cut and dried now depended on very fragile clues.
After we lost the flashlight, about the last piece of physical evidence we had that we could try and do anything with were the leaf fragments that were recovered out of the Jeep.
If investigators could find specks of blood on the tiny fragments, they would support the idea that Stephen Vargas was close enough to the body to have tracked them into his Jeep. It fell to supervising criminalist Pilar Shortsleeve to analyze the minuscule samples.
Trying to see blood on a small piece of colorful leaf was difficult. So we used a stereo zoom so we could get down and look very closely at the leaves, and then to kind of guesstimate if we had any stains, and then we would do some preliminary tests. Well,
out of the 5 samples of leaves, Pilar Shortsleeve found traces of blood on 2, but she had no proof the blood was the victim's. She rushed the samples to a DNA lab for analysis, fearing it might already be too late.
Whenever blood or body fluids are left on soil or samples that contain a lot of possible bacteria, the bacteria begin immediately in destroying the sample. They destroy not only the cells, but they get into the DNA and start to break the DNA down.
It would take 3 months for the results to come back from the lab. Investigators had to bide their time, but they didn't do it idly. They had to assume that the results would be negative and began to build their case some other way. Police served a warrant to search Vargas's apartment. They were after the bathrobe and slippers he was seen wearing at the crime scene. If he had beaten his wife to death, surely they'd be blood spattered. Vargas left the clothes in plain sight, easy to find.
What are you looking for, Detective? Murder. He was supposed to be wearing a bathrobe and a pair of slippers.
The bathrobe had been freshly laundered. The slippers had no trace of debris on them. That in itself was strange, considering he admitted walking outdoors in them.
It seemed like Stephen Vargas was one step ahead of us on getting rid of any physical evidence that might link him to the crime scene. It seemed like every step that we thought of to locate that evidence was foiled.
Robert?
Yeah. But there was one clue he couldn't bury, because it was 375 miles away in Cheyenne, Wyoming. After several weeks of wrestling with his conscience, Vargas's half-brother, Robert Esquivel, called police to tell of a favor that Stephen had asked before Becky's murder.
Steve had asked him if he would come out here and kill Becky for him.
Police set up a phone tap in Esquivel's apartment and had him call Vargas to get him to talk about their previous conversation.
Steve had gone through this denying or not remembering that part of their conversation, that it had been a joke, and towards the end even got threatening.
Though it stopped short of a confession, Vargas had said enough for police to arrest him on January 11, 1996, for the murder of Becky Vargas. But they weren't sure they had enough evidence to convict him. 1 month later, the results of the DNA test on the blood-spattered leaves found in Stephen Vargas's Jeep came through. A comparison of the DNA from the blood on the leaves matched Becky Vargas's DNA.
The blood on the blood fragments matched Rebecca Vargas.
Now
Yes.
authorities were confident of a conviction.
Where are you going?
Based on the evidence, police put together a likely scenario. Stephen Vargas, angry with his wife for her infidelity and their upcoming divorce, confronted her at her new apartment. They fought.
Don't you dare accuse me of being a bad woman, don't you?
It escalated. and he hit her with the flashlight, knocking her out. He moved her to the side of the house, thinking she was dead. He was wrong. He wanted someone else to find the body, so he asked the McLeans to check up on her. They mistook her death throes for the throes of passion. When they told Stephen, he returned to finish what he'd begun, using a more lethal weapon. Tiny fragments of leaves told the whole story.
Well, in this case in particular, we had this flashlight that had a possible fingerprint in it, in blood, and that would have been the piece of evidence that kind of closed all the loose ends, but it didn't happen. In this case, it was a very small piece of leaf that was found in a vehicle that had blood on it that came from the victim, and it was just the interesting and exciting part that something so small could be so integral in a case.
Stephen Vargas was convicted of first-degree murder and is now serving 20 years to life. The case of Becky Vargas began with the discovery of her body. But when a person just disappears, it's not clear that a crime has even been committed. In this story, the names of the victim and the killer have been changed. On the morning of July 31st, 1987, Dan Remington of San Diego, California, was taking his kids to the YMCA. En route, he noticed his wife's abandoned car on the side of the road. Not wanting to alarm his children, he dropped them off at daycare, then rushed home to call the police. San Diego police dispatched an officer. On his way to Remington's house, he stopped to examine the vehicle. The car apparently had a flat tire. The doors were locked, and he could see no spare, nor any sign of 29-year-old Liz Remington. When the officer arrived at the Remingtons' home, Dan Remington told him that he last saw his wife at 10:30 the previous night when she left for work.
About 10:30 last night. We're going to go and get ready to go for work.
After he saw her car at 7:30, he called the hospital where she was a maternity nurse, but she hadn't shown up. Remington admitted that their 12-year marriage was rocky. They were discussing divorce, but hadn't filed the papers yet.
I called around and made a couple phone numbers. You have by chance have a key for the vehicle?
Dan handed the officer a key to the car and granted permission to impound it in search of clues. While it was possible that Liz's disappearance could be logically explained, missing persons cases fell under the domain of the homicide unit. They had the skills to collect and preserve every piece of potential evidence found at the scene.
Check the spare yet?
They found nothing obvious to indicate foul play and towed the car to the police garage. Any overlooked clues would be preserved in case the car required a closer look. Detectives visited a nearby convenience store, thinking that Liz might have gone there after her tire went flat. The clerk told them that she had been in the night before. She needed to break a $20 bill to make a phone call. He didn't know who she called. Police remembered that Dan Remington told them she hadn't called home. It seemed reasonable to believe she may have simply run off with someone else. Liz's sister told police that was inconceivable. She wasn't the kind of woman who'd run from a failing marriage. No matter how bad things became, she'd never leave her children. Sergeant Dennis Brugos of the San Diego Metro Task Force found that was the consensus.
She was very devoted to her children and her family. She helped at school, she helped at Little League, and just not the type of woman that would ever walk away from her family.
Liz's sister told police it was strange that the spare tire was missing. Dan had changed the oil 2 weeks earlier and made a point of thoroughly checking the car, including the spare. Investigators took statements from the Remingtons' neighbors. Many spoke of the deteriorating relationship between Liz and Dan. The information was duly noted, but in terms of evidence that any crime had been committed, investigators had absolutely nothing. At the time of Liz Remington's disappearance, San Diego police were grappling with an apparent serial killer. Because there was no evidence that Remington had left against her will, these more violent crimes took priority.
There was no body, there was no weapon, and therefore she was simply one of many missing adults throughout this county. And at that particular time, there was actually a series of sorts that was going on where there was upwards of 40 women who were found murdered in the East County area. So certainly that would have precedent over a missing person.
4 years passed since Liz Remington's disappearance. Most of the murdered women were transients or prostitutes, so she was not considered one of the killer's victims. But when a task force was formed to look into the serial killings, her file came up too, and investigators realized she was still missing after all this time. The neighbors' taped statements and the detective reports were dusted off. Well before Liz's disappearance, they had kept a close eye on the Remingtons and helped Liz out whenever they could. Over time, friction between the couple increased, and neighbors grew concerned about her and the children. One even kept a log of what went on at the house after Liz disappeared. To demonstrate how the Remingtons' relationship had deteriorated, a neighbor told investigators about how Dan tried to sell Liz's car without her permission. According to the neighbor, Liz wasn't just surprised, she was furious. A huge fight ensued. He said that the only reason Dan didn't sell the vehicle was because Liz had the only key and wouldn't give it to him. But police recalled that on the day Liz disappeared, Dan had the key to her vehicle in his possession. Police also learned that neighbors had reported seeing Dan Remington filling in a ravine at the back of his property with a bulldozer shortly after Liz's disappearance. They said that after her disappearance, they saw him visit that part of the property every few days. He never ventured back there before she disappeared. Remarkably, because the case had never been officially closed, Liz's car had remained impounded all this time. Dan had sued to get it released, but lost. Technically, it was still considered evidence. Now it would be looked at more thoroughly. One of the first things investigators found were coins in the ashtray. Purportedly, Liz had been last seen by a convenience store clerk when she wanted change to make a phone call. The clerk's statement suggested she was okay, Now, investigators weren't so certain, since she had ample change in her car. They contacted the clerk to interview him again.
That clerk at the convenience store actually said he wasn't real sure that it was her. So that helped us to establish the fact that we didn't really know for sure whether she was there.
Suspicions of foul play had been aroused. Rugos wondered if the flat tire could have been staged. He sent the flattened tire from Liz's car to Goodyear Tire and Rubber in Akron, Ohio. Their lab is designed to evaluate the causes of tire failure.
Here?
The tire was examined on the rim.
Report was the tire was flat, is still flat, there's definitely no...
Investigators found no outward signs of damage. Only a tiny puncture, which would have led to slow deflation. Once the leak was isolated, Product Analysis Manager Chester Patterson took the tire off its mount and examined it more thoroughly. From the looks of it, the tire went flat after the car had stopped.
We saw no damage on this tire. We saw no reason to have alerted any driver in the vehicle that something was going soft or whether the tire was deflating. Because in order to do that, the tire is beginning to come apart, and you would see that damage on the tire itself, and we saw no such damage.
But he did see something he'd never seen in his 35 years' experience. The tire removed from Liz Remington's car had been punctured from the inside out.
This tire has been punctured from the inside. See these two impressions, circular impressions, right under the punctures of the tire. And we noticed the rust that's contained in them. And it told me that somebody had taken a nail and pounded it through the inside of the tire to cause that circular nail head impressions on the liner itself.
He concluded that the tire had definitely been tampered with. 4 years after Liz Remington's disappearance, investigators had enough to get a warrant to search Dan Remington's house. They found nothing of significance inside. Outside told a different story. In the yard, a police backhoe went to work excavating the filled-in ravine.
The backhoe was probably 2 or 3 hours into the job when it hooked onto a piece of chain link fence that was lying flat. The excavation slowed down. What we found underneath that chain link fence was a tire.
The tire was the missing tire from Liz's car. And underneath that tire, wrapped in sheets and blankets, was the body of a female. And a missing persons investigation became a murder case.
Sir, put your hands on the counter.
Dan Remington was arrested and taken away. Officially, the body was considered a Jane Doe until a positive ID could be made. A forensic anthropologist determined the remains were those of a Caucasian female who had died of blunt trauma to the head. She had been in her late 20s to early 30s, about the same height as Liz Remington. It seemed like they had found what they were looking for, but the law required more proof than that. Forensic dentist Norman Sperber was called in.
Everything hinged on the teeth. Teeth are the most durable part of the body, and we fortunately had dental films from her dentist. We were able to take films of her teeth because they were in very good condition.
By comparing the shape and position of the victim's fillings and teeth with Liz Remington's dental records, Sperber was able to make a positive ID. Liz Remington had been found. Because the victim was discovered wrapped in bed linens, investigators believed that Dan killed her while she was napping before work. Afterward, he carried the body out to the ravine, buried it in a shallow grave, then rented the earth-moving equipment a short time later, piling on 8 to 12 feet of dirt. Then he drove to the scene and replaced the good tire with the one he had flattened. Next morning, he reported his wife missing, confident the police would never piece it together. His unwitting accomplice was a suspected serial killer who demanded all of the police department's resources. But the clues eventually resurfaced, exposing the crime. Though Remington's exact motive will never be known, authorities believe he couldn't bear the shame of divorce or the fact that he'd lose half of his wealth and property. In October 1992, Dan Remington was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife. He was sentenced to life without parole. Remington went to a great deal of trouble to hide his crime. Others take an easier approach, which sometimes makes their crimes harder to solve. On September 21st, 1995, a body was discovered in a wooded area in Boise, Idaho. Plastic bags bound with duct tape encased the feet and head. From its state of decay, it had obviously been there several days. No ID was found. No attempt had been made to conceal the body. It appeared to have been hurriedly dumped there. Because of its position and wrappings, investigators couldn't even determine the victim's gender without disturbing an already disturbing scene. At this point, anything could be a clue, so the body wasn't unwrapped or inspected until it got to the morgue, where it was scrutinized under controlled conditions.
Okay.
The tape was carefully cut away, and the bags removed and preserved. The victim was female, around 60 years old. The coroner determined that she was strangled. She was most likely killed elsewhere, wrapped up, and transported to the woods where she was found. She fit the description of Wanda Kuzmichev, reported missing 6 days earlier. Wanda had been reported missing by her second husband, Ben Kuzmichev, when she failed to return from work.
I want you to see this. Look,
The couple had been married
Oh,
just
that's
4
beautiful.
months. Both had retired from the large firm they worked for.
Your father and you were a little...
Wanda took a job cleaning offices.
You are beautiful.
Thank you.
Ben, a Russian immigrant who had once been artistic director for the Idaho Ballet, now worked for a security company. After Ben reported her missing, detectives wondered if Wanda had had second thoughts about her second marriage and simply run off. But a check of her jewelry and possessions showed she'd taken nothing with her. That's never a good sign. And then her body turned up. The victim's car had not been found, so the bags she was wrapped in became the most important clue. Criminalist Cynthia Hill set to work examining them. It was all she had.
Well, in this case, we didn't have a murder weapon. There were no eyewitnesses, and the place where Wanda was found was not the murder scene. So all these things were playing against us.
Hill fumed the bags in superglue to bring out any fingerprints. The glue, contained in foil pouches, vaporizes and bonds to the print, preserving it. The print can then be dusted with powder to make it more visible. Then photographed to create a record. Hill found only one print on the bag around the victim's legs, but so far she had no one to compare it with. Ben Kuzmichev was called to the police station to provide a set of prints for comparison. In a murder investigation, it's standard procedure to get a spouse's prints.
You ever been fingerprinted before?
No, sir.
Let me do all the work, okay?
Usually, it eliminates the spouse as a suspect. In this case, that isn't quite how it worked out.
Keep this?
The print on the bag matched Ben's. That didn't necessarily mean he'd had a hand in his wife's murder. If the bag had been taken from the victim's own car, Ben might have handled it prior to its use in the crime. The print was lifted from a portion of the bag where one would normally grab it. In terms of evidence, it wasn't enough.
These people are living together. They're touching objects that one another touch. You have to be able to find a fingerprint in a location where they wouldn't normally have touched, or it's in conjunction with another piece of evidence that puts them at the scene.
Hill still believed that the bags might contain more prints. Though she didn't have the technology to lift them, she knew that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Crime Lab did. If prints were there, the Mounties could find them, or so she hoped. She carefully packed her bags, sent them to Canada, and awaited the results. While Cynthia Hill waited for her prints to come from Canada, investigators in Idaho found Wanda Kuzmichev's car. More than a week had passed since her body was discovered. The vehicle had been abandoned in a store parking lot 4 miles from where she was found. Police processed the vehicle for fingerprints. They raised 2 prints from the trunk lid. Their placement suggested they were left by the person closing the trunk. Inside, investigators found something surprising. Nothing at all. For Detective David Smith of the Boise, Idaho Police Department, that was a significant discovery.
In talking with family members, they said that she would always carry her Jehovah's Witness literature in the trunk. In fact, they said you could not put anything in her trunk because it was so full.
But the trunk wasn't entirely empty. Investigators found a single drop of blood. It belonged to the victim. Whoever had put her in the trunk had also left fingerprints on the gear shift knob. Prints on the trunk and on the gear shift matched Ben Kuzmichev. Investigators faced the same challenges as before. The car belonged to Ben's wife. It stood to reason that he could leave his fingerprints on it. Still, it seemed strange that his were the only clear prints found, especially since he told police that as far as he knew, Wanda was the last person to drive the vehicle. The evidence suggested that Ben drove it last, leaving behind the clearest prints.
Tests were conducted to show that in approximately 70% of all cases, the last person who drives the car and activates the gear shift lever will destroy the person's prints who drove the car prior to and leave their prints on the gear shift lever.
The prints made detectives 70% sure that Ben Kuzmichev was lying. That wasn't good enough. An inspection of the car seat disclosed another clue.
I knew Wanda's stature in that she was 5'4" and 140 pounds. When I looked at the seat, it appeared to me to be back farther than usual for a woman of that stature to be driving the vehicle. So I placed a female of 5'4", 140 pounds inside the vehicle. She was unable to reach the pedals, which appeared to be a comfortable driving position. Conversely, I put a male matching Ben's description, 5'11", 190 pounds, into the driver's seat, and they fit very comfortable.
The experiment provided more circumstantial proof that Ben was a liar, but it still didn't prove he was a murderer. By now, the Canadian Royal Mounted Police Lab had performed their tests on the trash bag used to wrap the body of Wanda Kuzmichev. The test, called vacuum metal deposition, is a state-of-the-art method for lifting difficult prints from plastic. The bag was placed in a vacuum chamber and then pelted with ions of gold, which cling to the plastic but not to the oily prints. Then it's exposed to ionized zinc, which clings only to the gold, leaving the prints untouched and in contrast against the plastic. The process revealed a second print on the bag. According to Cynthia Hill, the position of this print was far more incriminating.
The second fingerprint that was developed using the vacuum metal deposition proved that he had a direct contact with that bag because the positioning of the hand was in such a way that he would be grabbing the plastic bag, wrapping the tape around Wanda, and he would be the only one that would be leaving the fingerprint in that position at that time.
In most cases, that would be enough to win a conviction. But investigators weren't so sure. Proving a spousal murder on fingerprints alone would be a hard sell. The prints and other evidence they'd gathered gave them enough to get a search warrant for the Kuzmichevs' home. They found no signs that this was the murder scene. But they did find the Jehovah's Witness literature that the victim's family said she never removed from her car. The items presented more circumstantial evidence that Ben had been involved in the murder. By January 1996, 4 months after the crime, investigators were still building their case against Ben Kuzmichev.
Detective!
He began to feel the circle of evidence closing in on him, and he announced he was going back to Russia. At that point, police had no choice but to charge him with Wanda's murder.
Let me go.
If he returned to Russia, he'd be a free man, beyond U.S. extradition. Though they had enough to arrest him, they weren't certain they had a solid case for murder in the first. Between the time of his arrest and the trial date, investigators continued to gather evidence against Kuzmichev. Under surveillance in jail, he couldn't make a move without authorities knowing about it.
We placed monitoring devices on approximately 17 phones inside the jail at the Ada County Jail. That gave us the ability to monitor his conversations as outgoing as well as whoever he was seeing as a visitor. The end result was that we received nothing that could be used in court. Nothing incriminating came about the phone calls.
But help came from an unlikely source. Kuzmichev had confided details of his crime to his cellmate. The prisoner, disturbed by Kuzmichev's lack of remorse, reported the details to authorities. He had nothing to gain by doing so.
Ben and his cellmate were watching TV one evening when the news media broadcast that we had located a witness who had told us that she had, in fact, sold Ben duct tape and trash bags. The inmate told us that Ben found this humorous, that he had, in fact, purchased from this lady, but they were not the ones that we were looking for that he used in the crime.
The inmate's information, though hearsay, provided one more strike against Ben Kuzmichev. Investigators realized they'd gathered all they were going to get. They weren't sure they had enough. But because Ben was likely to be released and flee to Russia, they had to take the case to trial. From what police could put together, 4 months after their marriage, Ben and Wanda's honeymoon was over. He had been dependent on her money, but wanted to return to his homeland. She refused to go. Their animosity built, and Ben strangled her. He wrapped her body in plastic bags, emptied the trunk of her car, loaded her in, and dumped her in the woods. Then he abandoned the car in the parking lot. Based on the accumulated evidence, Ben Kuzmichev was convicted for the second-degree murder of his wife, Wanda, and sentenced to 21 years to life. For Detective David Smith, solving this case meant more than simply delivering justice.
You do become personally involved. I mean, this guy has come into your town, committed this heinous act, and now you have this grieving family that you want to do everything in your power to solve this case for. And that's how I personally take it, and I know any other seasoned homicide detective will tell you the same thing.
When spouse kills spouse, the clues are sometimes difficult to read. But the marriage of forensic science with good detective work can bring together what the killer had tried to put asunder.